Hey everybody, today we are beginning our investigation of stabilization policies and looking at what the government can do from both a fiscal and monetary stance when it comes to addressing output gaps in the economy. And today we're specifically going to be looking at fiscal policy and how that impacts the ADAS model. As far as the ADAS model goes, you can have demand shocks that are positive or you can have demand shocks that are negative. If you have a positive demand shock, it means that aggregate demand is shifting to the right. It creates an inflationary gap in which output is greater than potential output and price levels are rising. When that's the case, the economy is getting overheated and needs to be slowed down. So the response from a government perspective would be to follow what's known as contractionary policy, to try and shrink aggregate demand, shifting it to the left in order to reduce output and lower the price level. If you have a negative demand shock, it means demand is shifting to the left, aggregate demand is shifting to the left. When that happens, it creates a recessionary gap where output is now less than potential output, where price levels are falling. And in that case, the government has a different way to respond. In this case, the recession is occurring, causing people to lose their jobs, so unemployment is rising while price levels are falling. The economy needs a boost of some sort, and so the government can follow what's known as expansionary policy in order to shift aggregate demand to the right, to grow aggregate demand, to expand it, so that output is increasing, employment is increasing, and price levels are increasing. And that's the nature of stabilization policy. The government can follow either fiscal or monetary policy as a way to address changes in aggregate demand. So when demand shocks occur, the government can step in and attempt to try and circumvent the initial response or reaction to the market in order to bring everything back to long-run equilibrium. Now, it's possible that the government doesn't have to do anything. The economy, as we know from previous conversations, is self-correcting. The problem is that it can take decades to self-correct, and no one wants to wait that long. And so when the government faces pressure from the people to respond to a major economic crisis or a major economic event, they oftentimes will choose to pursue an active policy to either grow or shrink the economy, depending on which type of shock they've experienced. When it comes to fiscal policy, we're talking about the government's ability to either tax or spend. It's spending on goods and services, as well as transfer payments to people, as well as tax collections from people. Expansionary fiscal policy will cause aggregate demand to shift to the right. Contractionary fiscal policy causes aggregate demand to shift to the left. When it comes to increasing its spending on goods, when the government increases its purchase of products or services, it's adding to aggregate demand and shifts aggregate demand to the right. If it decreases its spending on goods and services, then that would cause a reduction in overall aggregate demand for goods and services and cause aggregate demand to shift to the left, which is contractionary in nature. The government has a spending multiplier, just like consumers have a spending multiplier. It's the exact same multiplier, 1 over 1 minus MPC. So if you haven't been dealing with the spending multiplier in a while, there's a chance to take some practice. So here's a question. You go ahead and press pause and work through the math and see if you get it right. If MPC is 0.9, how much should the government spend to close a $500 billion recessionary gap? If you clicked pause and did the math, then hopefully you came up with the answer of $50 billion in government spending. Why? Because there's a multiplier. 1 over 1 minus MPC is 1 over 1 minus 0.9, so we find our multiplier is 10. So the government has to spend some amount of money, which will multiply by 10 to get to $500 billion. So we would set that up by saying government spending X times the multiplier will equal the $500 billion gap. So we're just going to do a little bit of algebra, and that's how we get to $50 billion. If the government spends $50 billion, everything else being equal, it will multiply by a factor of 10 and get us that $500 billion worth of new aggregate demand, which will bring the economy back to long-run equilibrium. Transfer payments are essentially welfare programs. It is taking money from one person and handing it to another. So Social Security takes money from current workers and hands it to retirees. Medicare takes money from current workers and hands it to those who are elderly and in need of medical care. Medicaid takes money from current workers and hands it to those who are poor or have lower income. So the amount of transfer payments has an impact on people's disposable income and therefore their ability to purchase goods and services on their own. The taxing policy comes in a variety of forms. There's lots of ways the government can tax you: income tax, payroll tax, excise tax, property tax. There's lots of taxes. At the federal level, we're going to focus mainly on income taxes, but there's also payroll taxes and excise taxes, like I said. All of this impacts your ability to buy goods and services because it's impacting your disposable income. It's determining how much money is left over after tax to be able to buy the things that you're interested in. If we were to increase taxes, then that's going to lead to a change in our ability to consume goods. If I increase taxes, it means that I have less disposable income available for goods and services, which means it's going to reduce overall aggregate demand for goods because consumption is going to shrink. So it's contractionary by nature. And if you were to decrease taxes, then it's the opposite. It's expansionary in nature because if I cut taxes, it leaves more money in the hands of taxpayers that enables them to be able to purchase goods and services that they're interested in. It's important to keep in mind that taxes and spending are two entirely different animals, or two different levers the government has. It is very possible that the government can increase taxes and decrease spending, just as well as they could increase taxes and increase spending. So they're not connected, especially at the federal level where the government is allowed to take on debt if they need to. So you can actually decrease taxes and increase spending if you want, or decrease taxes and decrease spending if you want. So when you get questions dealing with taxes, you have to presume that everything else remains the same, that spending is the same as it was before, and that the only change that's occurring is this change in taxes. Now, when it comes to fiscal policy, not every policy is exactly the same. Transfers in tax policy tend to have a smaller multiplier than direct government spending. And the reason is because consumers have an MPS. They do save a portion of the money that they earn or that they're allowed to keep in the form of a reduction in taxes. Not every dollar from transfer payments is going to be spent. So you might get a Social Security check, but you're going to save a portion of it and spend the rest. And because of that, transfer payments and tax policy changes do not have the same overall effect as spending does. We can walk through an example. Let's assume the multiplier is 2, which means MPS and MPC are the same at 50%. If the government spends $50 billion on goods and services, or increases its spending on goods and services by $50 billion, then in the first round of multiplication, $50 billion is going to be spent. The next round, half of that $50 billion will be spent because the government spent $50 billion on goods and services. The people that they purchase the goods and services from will keep half and spend half because that's what we're assuming the MPC and MPS are. So in the second round of multiplication, we'll have $25 billion spent. In the third round, people will spend half and keep half of that $25 billion, so 12.5. Eventually, it would multiply out to $100 billion worth of goods and services created from an initial increase in government spending of $50 billion. It's a typical spending multiplier. If we were to do transfer payments, however, if the government were to give $50 billion in new transfer payments to people, maybe it's an increase in Social Security, then people will receive that $50 billion, but they will keep half in savings and spend the other half. So in the first round of multiplication, only $25 billion will be spent because the other half is saved due to people's MPS of 50%, which means that the second round, only half will be spent. So $12.5 billion, $6.25 billion. So if we were to multiply this all the way through, the tax transfer would lead to only a $50 billion increase in aggregate demand. It's like if you're at the top of a mountain and you have a snowball, when you're spending on government goods and services, you've got one size snowball and you roll it down the hill and it gets to be whatever size it is. If you stand in the same spot on the mountain, but you have now a smaller snowball to start because some of the money is being spent and some is being saved, and you start rolling it down the hill, you'll still end up with a big snowball, but it won't be as big as the other one because you started with a smaller amount to begin with. It turns out then that the multiplier for taxes and transfers is less than the spending multiplier. In fact, the tax multiplier is MPC divided by 1 minus MPC. So one way to think of this is basically that the numerator is getting at what percentage of the money that the government is putting towards its fiscal policy is going to be spent initially. If they're buying goods and services, 100% of that money will be spent in the first round. So that's why the numerator is 1. If I'm doing transfers and tax payments, then a portion will be spent. That is, the marginal propensity to consume will be spent. And therefore, that's what the numerator is MPC. Now, the government doesn't have to do changes in government policy to impact the market and to address output gaps. There are these things known as automatic stabilizers. Some spending and tax policies immediately begin to either accelerate or slow the economy on their own. For example, unemployment insurance is designed to help increase aggregate demand anytime people lose their jobs. When GDP shrinks and unemployment rises, then people qualify for unemployment, they get the check, and they start spending money. The government didn't need to create a new policy to alleviate that problem. The existing unemployment system is in place to sort of catch people as they're falling and help prop them back up. Discretionary stabilizers occur when a new policy needs to be implemented. So anytime you're making a change to a policy or creating a new one, it's discretionary in nature. Anytime there's an existing policy that people qualify for, then it's an automatic stabilizer. Government response only works in the case of demand shocks. If you have a supply shock, you have the situation we've talked about before called stagflation. In that case, stabilization policy is entirely ineffective. It cannot solve both the problem of rising prices and shrinking output. Why? Because fiscal policy is designed to deal with aggregate demand, and stagflation is being created by a shift in supply. No matter what the government does, it will make one problem better. It'll either fix inflation or the loss in GDP, but it will make the other problem worse. So, for example, if you're facing this stagflation situation, you could follow expansionary fiscal policy. But if you do, you're going to shift aggregate demand to the right, and it's going to solve one problem. It's going to increase output, but it's going to result in higher price levels. So if inflation was a problem before, it's worse now. And if you try to do contractionary policy, if we go from SRAS 0 to SRAS 1, and then we try and follow contractionary policy, then we'll shift aggregate demand to the left, and that will solve the problem of price level rises and inflation, but it's going to make unemployment worse. Now, the government can act whenever it wants, but it doesn't always respond to changes in output. Why? For a couple of reasons. One, because it takes a while to realize there is in fact a problem, and it takes 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth to qualify as a recession. That's 6 months before they realize that there's a need to actually do something. And then, because we have a free system of democracy in which the government has to debate and decide, there's decision lag. It takes time for the Congress to come to an agreement on what they ought to do and get that program implemented, or I should say passed. And then you have implementation lag. Once you've approved the money to be spent, you then have to find people to spend the money, put out contract bids, and then ramp up the program. It can take a year, 2, or more to get the money spent. By that time, the problem that you were trying to face may have already solved itself, and so you're then adding more spending into an economy that no longer needs the support. So the government doesn't always act when there's a problem. Sometimes it relies on natural adjustment. But when the problem is significant, then it's time to step in. We'll talk more about all of these different policies that the government has when it comes to fiscal policy when we're in class, work on some problems, and I will see you then.